Hello and welcome to the Star Wars Universe Podcast.
And the Animation Deliberation Podcast.
We're giving you the double team once again. That means we're talking about The Bad Batch, and today it's Season 1, Episode 2, Cut and Run. All that and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. I'm Matthew from the Star Wars Universe Podcast. Once again, we're doing these episodes of The Bad Batch in partnership with the great people at the Animation Deliberation, today represented by J Scotty St. Jay, how are we doing today?
Doing fantastic. I am one with the Force, and the Force is with me.
There you go. There you go. We have so many people on the Stranded Panda Podcast Network who want to talk about this show. Today, unfortunately, Zuhair Ali can't join us. He's currently mid-travel for Mother's Day things with his family. But we do have Paul Hoppy. Paul was the original host with me on Star Wars Universe Podcast. He and I have been talking about Star Wars for, about 27 years or so now, but somehow we still manage to surprise each other with new opinions. And I asked him about a month ago if he wanted to be a part of Bad Batch. He was like, no, I've done enough. I was about 10 minutes into the first episode when I thought, yeah, Paul's going to come on eventually. And here he is. Paul,
Nice.
how are we doing today?
I'm doing good. I enjoyed this episode. I enjoyed the pilot movie, basically, episode as well, as well as y'all's coverage of it.
Well, thank you.
And yeah, it's just it's good to be here and talking about a show that I enjoy. I figure I'll come on the episodes when I like the episode, and if I don't, I'll be like, you all do it.
There you go.
Yeah, I know sometime down the road, the Animation Deliberation Podcast has absolutely no lack of content, but I know at some point down the road, we definitely want to have Paul on to talk about some animes that are near and dear to his heart. So.
Oh, for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Cool.
Definitely. I know Paul is the one, along with Jacob Leachich, who got me into Avatar: The Last Airbender, which that is technically not in anime, and I'd like to be at least a part of at least one of those conversations, but you should definitely have Paul on for that.
Oh, certainly.
And I will say, at some point, I definitely want to have both you, J. Scotty, and Zuhair Ali. I think that's going to be kind of our main team, both because you two have such a great rapport together, and I want folks to hear that so they know what to look for in the Animation Deliberation Podcast, and just because I think it's so great to have both of you here on. But Paul's going to also be a part of it when he can. Brian V. Klein's going to be a part of it when we can. We've got so many people want to talk about the show because it's so good.
Yes.
So
indeed.
let's just start there. What do you guys think of this episode?
Well, Paul, from what I hear, you're pretty positive on this one, so I'll let you take the floor. What do you got, man?
Sure. I love this episode. It feels, first of all, this series to me so far feels like it's picking up right where the Clone Wars Season 7 did. I mean, literally with like that title card, the Bad Batch like coming over Clone Wars in the first episode.
Right.
And of course, a second time that an animated show has done Order 66 better than Revenge of the Sith. But
Now it's a pretty low bar, but yes.
True. Don't get me started on Order 66. But I thought they did it really well in this. And just in terms of tone and, look, I also feel like this show really picks up from there. I had rewatched the 4 episodes from Season 7 that were like the Bad Batch episodes. And this gives the characters, I think, more depth and personality. But there was something in that 7th season of Clone Wars that there's this, I feel like there's this, overriding sadness where there's this, this great tragedy in the galaxy, basically.
Definitely.
The world's headed in this really dark place.
Right.
But at the same time, you have these hopeful characters. And in this episode, I felt like we really got to see something that was super important. And I feel like we haven't seen much of in the Star Wars universe, which is, what happens to regular people when the Republic becomes the Empire. Right? Yeah. When the Jedi get wiped out, when when we're going from clone troopers to eventually to conscripts, right? And I felt like this episode very deliberately was kind of trying to show, okay, here's a family and here's what's going on with them now because of these changes in the galaxy. Whereas usually it's a bunch of, starship battles or lightsaber battles or blaster battles, but and all that's cool, and that's very Star Wars-y, right? But actually getting to kind of see how all of that reverberates with just ordinary people, I thought was really important, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's definitely the same thing that we often talked about with The Mandalorian being so important, is that kind of, both because you're seeing the regular people, but also, as you said, this is an incredible transition moment, and I think one of the things we've talked about complaining about in the past is that, Palpatine goes on internet TV or whatever it is in that universe and says, the Jedi betrayed me, now I'm scarred and deformed, now everything's going to change, and the Senate may all cheer for it, but how does that actually happen? What goes on? And so seeing all this stuff with the chain codes and people slowly accepting new authority was great. J Scotty, I want to hear your thoughts as well. But I realize, this show is going to be for everybody from the hardest of hardcore fans who've seen these episodes 5 times already, who've seen all the other older episodes, but as well as also those folks who maybe saw it or maybe even haven't seen the episodes and just want to kind of follow along and get a sense of what's going on and hear our analysis and thoughts. So putting you both on the spot, does either of you want to give kind of a quick 2-minute summary of what happens this episode?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I don't mind diving into that. So, and forgive me if I skim over any of the details. I tried to squeeze in 2 watches, so I should be pretty good here. But let me know if I flub anywhere. I can certainly adjust. So, as I recall, we open with they discover Omega has exhausted herself for the first time that they're aware, because she has explored every inch of their ship, and they subsequently land on, is it Seleucami or Seleucami? The swamp planet that we saw in Revenge of the Sith?
I'm so bad at pronouncing. I believe it's Seleucami.
Seleucami, okay.
I
know we saw it in
in Spanish, Cantonese, and French, so I don't. I can't vouch for the. But
I know we saw it in the montage during Order 66 in Revenge of the Sith. Anyway,
right.
From there we are introduced to one of their contacts that's going to help them, kind of fade out of the spotlight of the New Galactic Empire, given the pretty high publicity stunt they just pulled off by rescuing Omega from Kamino, and that person is someone that I'm not familiar with at all. I have to provide that precursor that I'm going into the series without having watched any of the Clone Wars except for those 4 episodes of the Bad Batch.
Right.
So I don't know if this clone Cut and his partner Sue, I don't know if they've showed up before, but I certainly appreciate that the universe is expanding and introducing more characters, and we get to spend time on these planets that we just got as snapshots before. Other than that, Omega gets to spend time with children for the first time in her life, having been a clone on Kamino. She definitely has some learning experiences there, as well as Hunter in terms of, acting as a father figure to her. You mentioned how we get to see what's taking place with the common folk there, and we find out that in the city on Seleucami, the Galactic Empire is basically making everyone trade in whatever form of currency they have for Imperial credits, and to do that they have to basically register with an ID. It's called chain codes in the Star Wars universe.
Yep. Yeah.
So that also prevents them from having a way off the planet, because basically all vehicles are stranded unless they have these necessary chain codes. From there, I alluded to the fact that Omega, and I realize I'm going over 2 minutes here, so I apologize. I'm getting kind of in the minutia here.
There's a lot that happened.
Yeah. Omega basically is a stowaway on their ship, and Tech has the great idea to let the vessel just be abducted so that they can, infiltrate I want to call it the Imperial outpost, to get the necessary chain codes that they need there. Through this course, excuse me, I'm fumbling here a bit. Through this rescue, Omega delivers the necessary chain codes. Rex tries to, I don't want to say pawn her off to this family, but he sees it as the best upbringing for her. But she ends up being the necessary piece there at the end to even pull off the escape from the planet, and she finds her place with the Bad Batch and really gets solidified as a member of this found family.
Yeah. I think you hit most of the key points. I think the only kind of things I would really mention, first of all, you're right. We do have a lot of cut story from the Clone Wars, and we'll go into that because it's definitely very
I'll be interested to hear that.
Yeah. But I wonder, like, I know you were not as wild about this episode. I'm wondering if part of that's because you didn't have that backstory. But just a couple other key things is that he is a former clone who deserted.
Okay.
There's a kind of weird. He kind of got left behind, but he then just chose not to reenlist. He didn't run away from the battle or anything.
That's right.
But he
they
has
do
some
mention
of his own
he's a deserter,
kids.
yeah.
Yeah, he has some of his own kids with the woman he married, and he's basically kind of teaching Hunter. He's treating Hunter like, now you're with Omega, you're basically going to be a father.
Right.
And at first Hunter's really kind of concerned about that. He tries to arrange it so that Omega is going to go off with this other family, but when she realizes it, she's like, no, I want to go with you, and he kind of finally agrees to do that. So it's kind of a nice little like plot arc they have together.
Sure. Yeah.
So with that, J Scotty, what are your thoughts on the episode?
I will say overall I enjoyed it and found it to be another solid entry. I will say I picked up on a few of the criticisms that were levied on previous episodes that I didn't notice as much. And that's mainly in some of the character movements. The character movements. They felt a little more stilted this time around. And while I appreciated some of the whimsical overtones, some of the jokes just felt a little too catered to the younger audience, and that's okay. Anytime you have child characters, there's going to be opportunities for that. Sometimes I just find it to be a little more effective than other times, and some of these just landed a little flat for me.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. That's totally fair.
It's
interesting. I didn't pick up any of that, but
Okay.
I definitely am sensitive to that with other things. And
Okay.
I think I said I was kind of concerned about Omega showing up for exactly that reason. So I'll be curious to see where that goes.
Yeah. I'm curious. How are you guys feeling about like the voice performances, especially from like the kids? I know the first episode's coverage, we kind of talked about the discrepancy between the way Omega like pronounces her name versus all the other characters.
Right. Well, I think I'm gonna take the shot at answering that because I don't think Paul has watched this episode in English yet.
That's correct.
I don't mind it at all. I think D. Bradley Baker basically should like walk into an Emmy Award already for what he's doing in terms of voice acting.
Oh, of course.
Of all the clones. And now Cut was yet another main character we had who had another distinct voice.
Agreed.
And I think Omega, we started to learn more about how Omega came to be, and I think there was we were talking before about like, is she another clone? How would that happen? And a couple of people posted in the Stranded Panda group kind of confirming what I'd been theorizing, that, you certainly can like take a clone and then do something to it while it's still, embryonic or whatever, to have it be female and not male, or at least, biology, whatever the gender of the person's going to be.
Sure.
And so to me, her accent, especially given that she was just raised on Camino and probably somewhat isolated from some of the other clones and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense to me. And I thought the voices of everybody else sounded fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Nothing that I noticed one way or the other.
Okay. Just asking.
Was there anything odd about French, Mandarin, or Spanish?
Cantonese. They don't have Mandarin, but no. I mean, it's they. So I looked into the voice acting a little bit. First of all, in the English version, the character of Omega is voiced by Michelle Ang or Ong. I'm not sure. I think Ang. And who is also from New Zealand.
Sure.
So I don't know whether there's kind of a difference in terms of, the accents there, if they're like different areas of New Zealand, or if there's something deliberate. The character does in the languages I've listened to it in, sound, different from the other clones, but all the other clones do sound different from one another, and mostly are all played by one voice actor for like all the Bad Batch. Some of the
that's awesome.
Yes, some of the languages have like one of the like Crosshair is a different actor or something, but mostly they save money and lean on someone doing an impressive job of arguing with themselves or talking to themselves. And I mean, I think
that really makes sense for. Okay.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that really makes sense for the character of Crosshair. Even though he didn't appear in this episode, he definitely has one of the most distinct voices amongst the Bad Batch.
Okay, yeah.
Right. And certainly from his appearance, we haven't heard anything more about this, but he looks significantly older. Like, his hair is gray.
Right.
Yeah,
things
true.
like that.
Yeah.
And so, just based on, like, vocal cords changing as the body gets older, like, him having a somewhat different voice would make a lot of sense.
For sure.
So, yeah, in terms of me, I think I loved this episode. I wanted to kind of, claim a little bit of credit. Last time I'd said, that I thought when we were talking about who they might be going to visit. I think I said this on air. I know I definitely said it when we were all sitting around having watched the show, that I thought maybe they were going to go to one of the deserters, one of the former clones. And so I was really happy to see that had been correct.
Former clone troopers. There's still a clone.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, one of the former clone troopers. And let me give you just a little bit more of that backstory, because I think it's actually a really important part of why I think I like this episode so much.
Yeah, me too. Sure.
In the episode where he gets introduced in the Clone Wars, again, he's not someone who ran away from the battle. It's that he was kind of left behind. I think people thought he was dead, but he got pulled into healing. And then what happened was that Rex, who's a commander from the Clone Wars, who I think we're going to see on this show, he got mentioned in this episode, a major character in the Clone Wars, and in some other later properties of Star Wars.
Retroactively, right?
We'll see.
Okay.
I don't want to do anything spoilery.
Gotcha.
About that. But so in this episode, Rex figures out who he is, and at first it's like, come on, soldier, you have to come back to the war. And by the end of it, Rex is kind of understanding why he doesn't want to go back to the war. And you get the sense that he's making Rex question some things that Rex didn't want to question, because it's one of the first times that this whole idea of what is a clone trooper if he's not a soldier anymore? Who is that person? What would, and I think he asks Rex at one point, like, what'll you do when the war ends? And given that the Bad Batch are kind of confronting a lot of those questions, I just thought his appearance was so perfect.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts of the Clone Wars, was specifically this character's story. And, the idea of being a deserter, right? It's like, these aren't deserters. These are people who escaped slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, they were literally born into a task which they were raised to do from the moment of birth, and then they're expected to spend their entire lives fighting for some empire or republic originally. But and leaving seems like a very valid choice, because there was never a choice to join and fight. Right? That was never a thing. So yeah, Cut, I always found a very interesting character and gave some sort of context and some deeper thoughts to like what's going on in the Clone Wars. And the Bad Batch is, given that they just left, the Galactic Army, I guess, it makes total sense to me that they would interact here. And I hadn't really expected this. I hadn't given too much thought to like where they were headed, but when they got off the place and like I saw those plants, I was like, I know those plants. And I feel like that's one thing that I really like about the animation. I have some of the same reservations in terms of movement. I feel the faces are a little stiff. It's all computer generated, right? So it doesn't have that like really personal hand-drawn animation touch. I mean, I guess most things these days are computer animated, but it's got a little bit of a blocky feel. But I feel like all of the animated series, and especially this now, really do a great job of giving us locations and making them feel different. And just being on this planet, I was like, oh, I know this place.
Right.
And then seeing, Omega's joy at like meeting dirt for the first time, what's this?
It was so great because that scene, basically she walks off the spaceship, puts her hand in the dirt, and it's just so clearly like she literally asks, "What is this?"
Yeah.
Right.
And I thought it was such a wonderful way, without lampshading it, but of just reminding us she has lived her entire life on Kamino, which is this like basically kind of like a biodome kind of a planet where you never actually go out in nature, as far as I can tell.
Right. It seems like it's always storming outside.
Yeah, it's a ocean planet that's constantly raining, from what I can tell.
Okay.
It's really interesting to get that context for the character of Cut, and I'd be curious to learn more about Sue. Was she in the picture in Clone Wars? Was it obvious that she was going to be a romantic interest for him?
So he only really appeared for one episode. They may have gone back to him a couple times, but it was mostly one episode. And when they meet him, one of the problems with the TV show The Clone Wars is it was not aired in chronological order, but the implication is that we meet him fairly late in the Clone Wars, when he hit the battle where he got lost was very early. And so basically Rex meets this guy who has a wife. She's a Twi'lek, and they have two very small kids. And then Rex realizes why he recognizes this guy. It's because he is also a clone. So yeah, at the time we met Cut, he already had the wife.
Yeah, he had a family.
Another question I would pose: did you guys get the impression that the children were actually Cuts and not adopted in any way, shape, or form? I felt like they tried to visually depict the fact that it could have been, interspecies offspring there.
I think he's their adopted.
Is he? Okay.
Stepfather, okay. Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
I think we learned that I definitely wasn't clear on that during this episode, but
right.
Looking it up, it looks like in the original episode it was established that he's like their stepdad, basically.
Right.
Okay, well then that might even highlight the point I wanted to make even more so. Not having had exposure to the Clone Wars series like that, for me, this is the most, compassion I've ever seen out of any clone. We've got the small snatches from Hunter, both with Omega already, and with was it Caleb? Was Kanan's original name Caleb Dune? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, but this is the first time you see this level of intimacy and understanding and ability to, take emotional turmoil and turn that into comfort. And I really appreciate that aspect of seeing the evolution of what a clone could become,
Definitely. And I think that's somewhat the point, is that, as Paul said, they were slaves. They were meant to only ever be soldiers. And part of what that meant was they were meant to only really have relationships with fellow clones and with their Jedi generals.
Right.
And the idea that they could meet and even fall in love with people sort of outside the clones is completely unheard of.
Sure.
And so that's why it was so surprising to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it is also a topic, I'll say, that's explored somewhat in the books, Republic Commandos, which are legends. They're not officially canon, but a lot of these stories do seem somewhat drawn from. The other thing I will say is, and I don't think they're going to go into this necessarily, because this is more of kind of an adult topic, but one topic of discussion is, can the clones reproduce? Are clones, sterile? Is a topic that I don't think has ever been discussed. And I don't know if it will, but I think to me it has very significant consequences in terms of what kind of life can or cannot clones have outside of, you know, being soldiers.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I hadn't really contemplated that at all, but that's definitely a whole conversation for itself.
Right. Anything else you want to say about like the cut aspect of it all? Or should we move on to Omega?
I would say like they definitely put Cut and his family's lives in danger by showing up, you know, and like so did Rex. Like I get it. It's like you don't have a lot of friends in the galaxy, but this person's clearly trying to hide, you know, and you've got the fuzz on your tail. Like, you know. Like, I don't know. Maybe not the most responsible decision, but they did help him out. So, all right. I guess we're good.
I feel like that's such a trope, though, of like, you know, your heroes show up at the person who's in hiding, and then like the person's like, oh God, please don't be here. You're going to get me in trouble. And the hero's like, no, it's fine. Oh, whoops. Okay, the whole cops followed me, and your kid just got shot. Oops, I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I'm glad that nothing bad ended up happening to them, at least in the scope of this episode.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. So I like that we get to learn a lot more about Omega. You know, just those scenes of like her not really having any kind of real childhood, I thought were powerful. And again, it was very subtly done, which I really like. But there were a couple moments where like the kids ask Omega if she can come out and play ball with them, and she just immediately looks over to Hunter for approval.
Right.
You know, and I got a sense of like they're already establishing they're all kind of like, family, but Hunter's really the dad for her.
Right.
And the two of them have the strong connection.
Yeah, we saw it kind of broadcasted in those first 3 episodes where you had the nice little series of her constantly, imitating whatever he was doing at any given time. She has definitely become quickly endeared to him.
It reminded me of the Grogu. It reminded me of the Grogu and Mando moment at the end of season 2 of Mandalorian. This sort of like asking permission, and in this case it's just a nod. Hunter often, I think, communicates just with a nod, like to Wrecker to get the boot off the spaceship, basically, like go, and then they know.
Right.
Yeah. No, I'm absolutely glad you bring that up, because the Mandalorian comparison was made earlier on when we were just talking about getting to see more smaller, intimate interactions with the regular, townsfolk of Star Wars, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. I definitely felt those overtones as well, and that's definitely one thing I appreciate about this series. Not only is it exploring a timeline or a time zone in the Star Wars that we haven't gotten a lot of, clarity on. You just feel that synergy throughout. The Mandalorian has been, for all intents and purposes, accepted by the masses, and it seems like they're really, leaning into that. And I definitely feel that in the Bad Batch. So it's another thing that makes the series already off to a phenomenal start as far as I'm concerned.
For sure. And I feel the whole franchise is trying to move a little bit away from the bad dad's trope towards the good dad's trope.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
Good call.
Cut to.
I will say, like, Hunter's clearly going to be the father figure here, but I don't have kids of my own, but I'm certainly an uncle often. Like, my sister doesn't have any kids, but she might. And I have a lot of friends who have kids, and I like to go over and play with when I visit and stuff like that. And Wrecker is absolutely Uncle Goals.
Oh, yeah.
Like, he's just so good with kids. And
solid.
I think we actually had talked about how we were worried that Wrecker was going to be a little one note. And we actually got some great comments in the Stranded Panda chat group about how, no, Wrecker's so much. And I thought this was such a beautiful way to show that. Like, just that little moment of Wrecker with the kids was like, no, yeah, okay, this is who he is. He's a big kid himself, but that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had posed the question, given what we learn about the inhibitor chip and given Wrecker's love for destruction, kind of echoed a little bit Crosshair's love for doing what he does best. I wondered if there was potential for him to, become subject to the inhibitor chip. And while I still think there's a slight possibility for that in terms of, a really nice dramatic turn, this episode really dissuaded me from those thoughts, in addition to the feedback we got. So I really valued that.
Definitely. It did leave me wondering, Cut would still have the chip.
Right.
And I don't know if the implication is... Now, we did learn that by the end of Season 7 of the Clone Wars, Rex seems to understand how to get rid of the chip. So I don't know if Cut was just hanging around with his family going like, guys, I have a weird urge to kill Jedi. There's no Jedi around, which is good, but I kind of want to kill one. And Rex kind of helped him with that, right. Or if he just never had the urge because he's been away so long. I mean, they did say, you know what, maybe? There was that moment in the Bad Batch episodes of Clone Wars where kind of all the soldiers got their chips, like, strengthened. And so maybe because Cut didn't have that, it didn't kick in.
Right.
I'm guessing it's a small little plot thread that I'm guessing they won't follow up, but it's just an interesting thing to think about.
For sure.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Empire, because I think that was, Paul, you brought up at the beginning, I think in some ways that was the most powerful part of all this for me. To me, it really just spoke to, like, I've done a lot of study of, like, how authoritarian governments come into power, how, like, Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin or things like that, like, and surveillance is, and perhaps modern day governments, surveillance and, like, starting to, like, number and register people is almost always some of the first steps.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that made the sort of authoritarian states of the early 20th century possible was that technologically it became possible to actually, like, keep track of all of your citizens. And it's so subtle, but just the stuff about the chain codes and everyone having to register, and the fact that you're seeing more and more surveillance everywhere. I just thought it was just so brilliantly done. Of like, this is how the Empire really like gets its hooks into everybody.
For sure. I would just strike the bit about it being subtle. It didn't feel very subtle to me, but it felt, very everything else you said, totally.
Yeah. Right. I mean, subtle in that the people aren't thinking like, oh gosh, an Empire's taking over. Like, to them, it'd be like, okay, there's a chain code. It's not a big deal.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I get it.
I would say outside of like Order 66, this has been one of the best showcases as far as really seeing that transition from clone trooper to stormtrooper. Like, I think back on that scene where you had the alien that was trying to get off planet and doesn't anticipate the resistance that he's going to get and gets shoved to the ground. Like, that's just, that's something out of A New Hope or Rogue One.
Yeah.
Right.
And we hadn't seen the clone troopers behaving that way before, really, because we hadn't seen them acting in that capacity. Right. Like, the war's over, but they're still troopers.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. And they no longer have the Jedi with them.
True.
It kind of makes you wonder, like, to what extent the Jedi were kind of a mitigating force.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally fair.
The other thing that I kind of got out of all this was, and again, it's I mean, this is very true in our own world in many instances, some very modern, some more in the past. This kind of speaks to what you were talking about, Paul. I get the sense that this whole galaxy is very world weary, and especially very war weary.
Yeah.
There's just a kind of general sense of like apathy and fatigue, and like, I think some of the propaganda they say is that the Empire is going to like restore security and like make things, end the chaos. That's how, like, fascist leaders come to power, is by promising like, oh, all this anarchy and all this, long-haired kids in the streets or Black Lives Matter or whatever it is. Like, we'll take care of it. That people turn to that kind of stuff because fear is powerful and people are idiots. But like, it felt very believable to me that people would be like, yeah, okay, I'll have a chain code and make sure you know where I am on the planet if it means that like no longer droids and clones are blowing each other up in my backyard.
Right. But also just, it's like, what are they going to do?
Right.
Like, any individual isn't going to be like, oh, I'm going to start a rebellion. Like, it's not going to go.
And I think that would always be true, but also like after 3 years of this global galactic war, they're even less inclined towards that.
Is the Clone Wars really only 3 years? I'm not.
Yes.
I'm arguing with Star Wars, not you. Like, I find it so upsetting that it's that short. It doesn't make any sense. But okay. But I loved this episode.
Yeah,
things happen fast in a galaxy a long time ago, and far away.
Relativity. It was 3 years on one planet. It was 20 years on another planet.
Life can pass you by pretty fast if you don't stop to smell the fungus growing on Seleucami.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. You might miss it. Ferris Bueller in the Star Wars world. I'm down for it.
Hey.
I will also say in that same regard, though, I think it was the last episode, maybe it was this episode, but they did make reference to, it was actually in the last episode, but how that they'd been gone for like this many cycles by this planet's calculations, but this many cycles by like galactic calculations.
Right.
Kind of naming that like days pass in different speeds on different planets.
Right.
Like they acknowledge that a little bit.
Yeah, me too.
Last thing I wanted to check in on, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this. Is it at all surprising to you that our heroes, the Bad Batch, are so comfortable shooting their former like comrades and brothers, the other clones?
That's an absolutely great question, and I feel a little ashamed of myself that I really hadn't contemplated it until now.
Like in one of the first fights in the first episode, the first movie, we did see them using like the stun setting where it goes out in circles and stuff like that. Right. And since then they've been using blue lasers, which aren't like the red or green that normally clones and droids would use back and forth. But it does look like lasers. It doesn't look like sunbeams. They certainly haven't said any like, we can't kill our brothers, put it on stun or something like that.
They actually showed like one of the like chest guards or whatever kind of exploded from a shot in this episode.
Okay, so that's not a stun shot.
No, it's not. So I did think about this, but it might have been on my third viewing. So
okay,
J Scott, if you only watched it twice, I think it's fair not to have.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
So
makes me feel better. Thank you.
But Yeah, like, spoilers for season 7 of the Clone Wars, but it ends up being a really big deal about shooting or not shooting these clones who are, at that point, just totally mind-controlled, right? Here now, it seems like maybe it's kind of unclear to what extent they're just like, okay, now we're just doing what we were sort of socially programmed to do compared to, like, literally programmed with a microchip. But it makes a lot of sense to me, actually, that the Bad Batch are like, yeah, we're just going to shoot them. Rex had an affinity for the regs, right? Rex was he was a commander, and then he was a captain, I guess, or vice versa. So Rex had this real connection with, the other clones who he viewed as brothers, and, literally are. The Bad Batch have this conflict, and I think they feel outside of, the sort of regular group of clones. They call them regs. They I think they don't identify with them as, like, being brothers in the same way. And it did make sense to me that they are just like, yeah, we're just going to shoot them because, like, what are we going to do? As opposed to going to great lengths the way Rex did to try to not kill a bunch of them, right? But I definitely noticed that and thought about it. I was like, they could use stun, but they're not. And it's like, yeah, they're in a war against these guys, basically, who are trying to shoot them, trying to shoot to kill. Yeah. So
I would have to imagine that their interactions, not only with Tarkin, like knowing that the controls for the most part are acting under Tarkin's orders, and then the fact that Crosshair betrayed them and they were learning more outside of tech. He obviously knows what's going on with the inhibitor chips, but they learn a lot about the inhibitor chips in this episode. So I have to imagine that skews their perspective to some degree.
For sure. And in the first episode, they showed, they had that whole, like, food fight thing. But which sort of undermines my point that I was going to make of this being less of a kids show than the tentpole movies. Even though I still think that's true. But they did have a food fight, literally. But that, I think, showed, the way the other clones, like, treat them. And so it's like, yeah, they're more likely to shoot them because of that, whereas, like, they treated Rex with deference and camaraderie.
Right. I mean, I think it's definitely obvious that at some point they're going to come back into contact with Crosshair. And
yeah, sure.
I imagine that might be where... Well, there's two things, I think. One is, so far, they've fought the clones, but it's all been like, the clones are shooting at us, we have to shoot back so we can escape, kind of thing. I wonder if there's going to be a time where they're like, okay, to do whatever we have to do, we have to, like, attack these clones. And then there's a, like, can we do that without killing them? Or it might be, as you were kind of just saying, that as they learn more about the fact that this isn't the clones just being, terrible, it's the clones being mind-controlled, that they have more sympathy for them. But I definitely think there'll be a moment where they're like, where they basically have to face the concept of, can Crosshair be saved, or do they have to accept that Crosshair is now the enemy and has to be, like, fought? Right. And the fact that these characters were all introduced to us around the idea that Echo could be saved. And Echo was a reg, but the Bad Batch really bought into that still. And I get the sense that it's kind of that, like, you take three brothers who fight with each other constantly and, like, look like they hate each other and want to kill each other, but then if someone attacks one of them, all three brothers will fight back together.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's kind of what I think of it. Like, the Bad Batch and the regs are definitely, like, squabbling and don't like each other, and maybe they're not like, oh my god, I have to save you, but especially as I think there's definitely going to be that moment of, like, we have to save Crosshair, and there might be more loyalty towards the other clones as well, and that's going to be a really interesting story to see play out.
I agree.
So I think that's pretty much all the big things I had. Is there anything else you all wanted to touch on?
I have 2 points, one of which is tiny, and is maybe justified by the fact that the Clone Wars were only 3 years. So people never built up the level of mistrust that they would have if they ever wanted to close a spaceship door ever. Like, they just never closed the thing. And it's just, I don't know. It's like the new, like, dangerous doors for me. Like, now I can't not see when they just leave a ship with the door open every time. That's not really a big deal. And then the other one was I liked that, Omega had at the end, the agency of deciding, no, I'm going to stick with you all. And that's her decision. It's not just this just sort of circumstance, right? It's a choice. And so I think to somewhat level, she's choosing to be a soldier at some point. Not like a soldier for an army, but she's probably going to become some kind of warrior type person.
Right.
And since clones age faster, I'm kind of curious whether they're going to age her up over the course of the series. And I would have to imagine to some extent they will, but probably not too quickly. I mean, we've seen it in other animated shows, right? With Ahsoka, and then also with another character in a show that you haven't covered yet, and I'll save spoilers for that. But if it's going to be multiple seasons, I would have to think that she'll go from being this 10-year-old seeming person somewhere in there, maybe, to being more of a teenager and then eventually an adult, I would think.
I mean, one thing that I thought was very interesting is they established in the dialogue this episode that clone accidents aren't completely accidental. There's always some intentionality.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think there's definitely there was a particular reason that people made Omega.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if, as it seems to be, that she kind of is able to pick up the skills of anyone she's watching. Maybe she is some kind of a super clone. And to me, that says one of two things. One is she could be a fairly recent made clone who is aging up like all of them. But also remember, we've established in the universe that Boba Fett was made without the advanced aging.
Oh, right.
Right.
And so it's possible that she actually is quite old as well. I mean, by clone years, that she's
that she's 10 and not 2 or 3 or something.
Right, exactly. And that would still mean she's because I think Boba Fett at this point is 13, 14.
Right.
But still that she's there's a couple different ways in which she's not like other clones. But yeah, there's so much to figure out there.
Yeah. One little rebuttal I give just based on those thoughts right there is, that it's hard to say, Kaminoan headpiece that she was, the headpiece that she was wearing, that scene where she removed it, she was obviously already kind of in a compromised emotional state given her interactions with Hunter. But it seemed like she almost had a forlorn kind of longing sense. And we didn't really see it broadcast too much in the episodes that she was on Kamino, but do you think she had more of a, motherly relationship with, was it Lama Su, I want to say?
Lama Su, yeah. I definitely thought so. I got the sense, and I thought that was somewhat both ways. Lama Su, I think, definitely treated her more like a project, and but there definitely seemed to be some actual concern that Omega was gone.
Right.
In part just because the Kaminoans are clearly not sure what, they don't want to get killed by. I think they have to know that they are the definition of a loose end right now.
Oh, sure.
To Palpatine.
Yeah.
Palpatine.
Yeah.
But I do think that I don't think she was oh my God, get me away from Kaminoa. These people are slavers and are treating me horribly. I think she felt very out of place and she wanted to be with people she knew.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely think that there's some real connection there, and that Lama Su felt it as well.
Okay.
What was your sense, Paul?
I have the sense that there's something going on with their relationship and how she feels about Kaminoa, but also how she feels about the head bauble itself.
Right.
And that we don't know what it is. It's clearly just kind of a signpost, by the way, there's some emotional stuff going on here and we'll probably tell you about it later.
That makes sense. Yeah, so I think that's going to be a really fun plot to develop. Fun to see how the Empire is coming about. One just little world building thing that it was totally inconsequential, but I love getting to see tow trucks in this universe,
Yeah.
We got to see in The Mandalorian the AT-AT walker that's now been turned into a huge crane. And this to me kind of felt similar. It was just here's a random bit of tech that isn't for battles, though you can use it maybe, but just, an impounded ship. Here's how you pick it up. It's this flying thing that has a little mini tractor beam.
Right. For sure.
Yeah, it's nice to see the world expanded upon in that sense. I know you haven't completed the Fallen Order video game, but you get to see some of that kind of construction equipment in that game early on. So definitely nice to tie the universe together like that. And I'll take this opportunity just to provide my last couple thoughts. They're pretty inconsequential in the great scheme of things, but just a couple of things I appreciated. The Imperial officer that was present in the marketplace via hologram that was, delivering the news about the Imperial credits being the currency being converted to Imperial credits. Even though it was a model that is stylized and whatnot, I have to wonder, did they, base that off of the, I don't know how familiar you guys are with the Power Rangers series, the original Power Rangers, but I thought it looked like a spitting image of Jason David Frake, who portrays the Green Ranger Tommy.
I have never morphed in a way of might or otherwise, so I couldn't tell you, but I could be.
Okay.
I am also absent all useful thoughts on this subject.
I had a feeling it might go that way. The other thought, or the other little note here, is you mentioned Republic Commando earlier on, and just given the fact that this took place on the planet that it did, we got that one scene where Omega was in harm's way and she was endangered by the Nexu, who we haven't seen, correct me if I'm wrong, as far as, the film stuff goes, we haven't seen since Attack of the Clones, but me being a fan of the video games, there was a video game that came out in the 2000s, which is Legends, just like Republic Commando, but it was Star Wars Bounty Hunter, in which you got to play as Jango Fett before the events of Attack of the Clones, and there actually were Nexu on Seleucami that you got to, they were very deadly, but you got to interact with them, so... And nice to tie the universe together like that as well.
For me, that is the perfect way of integrating stuff like that into the content, because it's a perfect Easter egg for the people who played that game. But for folks like myself who haven't played the game, I don't feel like I'm missing anything of the plot,
Right.
And to me, that stands in contrast with, and fans definitely read us in. I'll be curious to hear from people on both sides of this. I do wonder if they needed a little bit more exposition of who Cut was, to help the people who hadn't seen that episode of the Clone Wars understand the significance of that scene. But because I think stuff like that of like, oh yeah, it's just this little toss-away thing that doesn't matter to the plot, but is interesting if you know it, like what kind of creature that is. That to me is awesome. That's perfect deep dive and continuity with some of this other stuff.
Yeah, 100% agreed.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it could have used a little bit more introduction of Cut and Sue and like what was actually going on there.
Yeah.
So with that, I want to close. We're going a little long this episode, but we got one great piece of feedback that I want to read, and he asks a couple of questions, so I'll kind of break it up into those. From Aaron Denning, he starts by saying, "Hey, Star Universe and Animation Deliberation podcast." So thanks for acknowledging both of us. He actually says, "Hey, Star Universe and Animation Deliberation pandas." So appreciate that. The Bad Batch premiere was awesome. I wanted to write in and talk to you about all my thoughts. And first he says, "Do you think Crosshair is going to be a villain or go through a redemption arc? I recall one of you saying that in the Bad Batch premiere episode that they didn't like his voice. I've always felt it was almost a Bond villain voice. Maybe they're setting it up in the introduction." I think he's going to get a redemption. I think the team is going to get reunited in some way. But what's your all thoughts?
I think either that or they're going to kill him.
Yeah, that's honestly, I'm leaning a little bit more that way.
Okay.
Even though this episode was a little more whimsical overall in tone, I think those first few episodes and just the title graphic, watching that Clone Wars logo burn away, I think we're just in store for a more it's just a darker and probably more heartbreaking story, just given the time period that it takes place in. We've already seen this is very much the Galactic Empire taking over and everything that comes with that. So those are my expectations. But I'd love to be pleasantly surprised.
That's fair.
I think it would be interesting to see them actually remove the chip from Crosshair, and then Crosshair to be like, "You still should have killed that kid."
Oh,
yeah.
I like that. Yeah, that's pretty good. I like that.
Yeah, because I do think that's I never like mind control. In some ways, mind control can be really awesome, but there's always a sort of frustration of it removes agency.
Yeah.
And most interesting conflict is when two people have agency but are choosing to do different things.
Right.
So it would be nice to see that, like, even without the chip, Crosshair still has some different thoughts. So the next question was two questions about Omega. I'll combine them into one. Aaron writes, Who is Omega a clone of? Is she the X-23 to Jango's Wolverine or another person's clone? I've always been under the impression that a true clone must be the same genetic gender because it's taking the exact same cells and regrowing them into a genetic copy of the donor. And yeah, I think same biological sex. However, with some quick Googling, it seems like someone could strip out the Y chromosome and replace it with a copy of the X. This is kind of what I was going at, that like you can make clones gender switched.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea if that's possible with Star Wars technology, but you can explain it away with some technobabble. Is it possible that Omega is maybe a genetic child to Jango, using his DNA to simulate a sperm donor, but a donated egg from a mother? And then they also ask, Omega's abilities sort of remind me of Taskmaster. She was able to copy the movements and ability of the rest of the Bad Batch.
Okay. I will just say, not being as versed in the knowledge of all the cloning technology and capabilities there, I would just say the evidence of the Bad Batch themselves. If you can make clones that look this physically different and have this range of abilities, I don't think it's, especially given the fact that you have the pseudoscience of being in a galaxy a long time ago and far, far away. They could probably do whatever they need to create a female version of Jango Fett. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of think all the possibilities are on the table, right? I mean,
yeah,
it could be a direct clone with just some, changing Y to X, or could be, I mean, we don't even know if they have, the same DNA that humans do on Earth, right? I mean, I don't think, so I feel like they could kind of go any way with it. They could have her be a clone of someone completely different, or Jango could effectively be like one parent genetically, and then they could have had someone else, like Padme. I don't know. Maybe she's a half sibling to Luke and Leia. Who knows? Exactly. Probably not that. Right.
And so the last question they raised, this is a little controversial here. We'll get into it. Caleb Dunes, a.k.a. Kanan's origins, and this is the Jedi Padawan who they didn't kill in the first episode, who becomes an important character in Star Wars Rebels, and thus has also appeared in some comics and things like that. Caleb Dunes' origins really disappointed me. Not because it wasn't awesome, but because it broke the pre-existing continuity. I always hoped that with the reset of canon after Disney bought Lucasfilms, that they'd be able to keep things tight. In Kanan's comic book from 2015, Order 66 happened while he, his master, and their troopers were around a campfire. The Bad Batch was obviously nowhere to be seen. I know it's small, it's at least on the same planet, and Depa still told him to run, but I would have been happier if they had the campfire and nighttime be the same, instead of it happening while Caleb was running to a new battle with a Bad Batch. It would have been so easy to make that happen. Where's that deep, hot continuity that Matt Carroll is always talking about?
Not in the Star Wars universe.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't have the familiarity with the comics in a lot of instances, especially with the Star Wars universe more so. But I think those are legitimate gripes. If you are paying, close attention to it, and Disney has put out the blanket statement that this is going to be the canon going forward, and you've eschewed, other properties to have that continuity, I think that's totally legitimate. But I will say it's always going to be the comic books probably first and foremost, and then the books, and then unfortunately, probably the cartoons, and then the movies. That'll be the pecking order in terms of, well, I probably should throw the Disney Plus series
right
in there as well. But yeah.
And you mean that from like least to most in terms of what's going to trump?
Exactly.
Yeah. I there's an extent to which I feel like continuity is overrated. I think there's some of these universes get so big and unwieldy that, like, I don't know. I feel like the MCU is going to have issues in 5 or 10 years, but
they already have.
They're
some.
already ours. Yeah.
Right.
But like, I definitely am sympathetic to someone reading a comic or book and being told this is canon. All that other stuff that you read before, that's not canon. This is canon. And then the powers that be being like, about that canon. When we said canon, we meant like, that's kind of like sort of what maybe happened.
Right.
And yeah, I just feel like the Star Wars universe hasn't been very good in terms of timeline and in terms of that type of canon. I think it has been very good in terms of just like broad world building. So to me, like, I feel like there's an extent to which it's like, you can kind of choose which things happened, which things didn't. Like, for me, the sequel trilogy is just an alternate timeline. And, like, okay,
that's fair.
You know? But, like, and then I can enjoy those new characters, who I love the new characters. I just don't like the stories or, like, the way they play off the existing stories, right? So, you know, it's just... I mean, you look at, like, the way certain things happened around there being Jedi or not being Jedi at certain times, and it's like, you know, they told these huge stories through the movies, and then they're trying to tell these smaller stories, but the huge stories are so huge that I think they just didn't leave themselves, like, enough space or oxygen in some spots, and sometimes there's just some hand-waving, and, like, this is the story we're going to tell right now, and we're going to try and tell the best story we can.
And I think that's really well put. I think, first of all, I just want to go on record. Like, people have heard us before know this, but we very much disagree with it about some of the sequels. I think Last Jedi is one of the best movies ever made and is perfectly in line with canon. Mm-hmm. We very much disagree, and that's fine. But I would agree. To me, Rise of Skywalker is completely non-canon. Like, that's a parody.
Right, exactly. So, like, you could just pick. You know, you could be like, that's not part of it for me.
Yeah.
But I think also...
Oh, sorry to cut you off here, but I'm sure we have. We've already alluded to it. That's what's so great about not only this series but The Mandalorian. It's going to attract, you know, all Star Wars fans from all corners of the galaxy. Mm-hmm. And so, for myself, I will say I have my issues with outside of, you know, the original trilogy. I have my issues with every single Star Wars film, but I get some level of enjoyment out of every single one of them. So
that's great,
and that's awesome. And I am. There may be I'm not even going to go into my thoughts on Rise of Skywalker yet.
Okay, fair enough.
I thought you were going to go to the prequel trilogy.
No, I mean, I've come to love those a lot more than I thought I did originally. Okay. Mostly because of Clone Wars, but because of just finding some really good things in them. Mm-hmm. If you can give me the Hayden Christensen less cut, where he just doesn't appear, then I think I'd like them even more.
You know, deepfakes are coming a long way. That might not be too far out of the realm of possibility here.
Can't believe we have to watch that actor in Kenobi. But anyway, my point being, it's not. He might be a great actor. He just couldn't play Anakin. But anyway, all that putting that aside,
I blame George Lucas.
Also very true, and the writers.
He was the writer.
Let me finish my point. Fine. We're on like 5 different levels of tangents here. The point I was going to make is that I do agree that I feel like for them to say, "Don't worry, this is all entirely canon," and then not make it exact isn't great, you know, and that they should be a little more careful about that. Mm-hmm. That being said, I think maybe I have a different definition of canon and continuity, which is, for me, characters have to stay the same. Plot points have to stay the same. World building has to stay the same. And what I mean by that is, you break canon when you introduce a change that makes other things not make as much sense. For example, Paul, you brought up, you kind of alluded to it, but I was being much more explicit. Like, in A New Hope, they specifically talk about how the Jedi are a forgotten religion. Mm-hmm. That is, like, it sounds like it's an ancient, forgotten thing. And then, like, much as I love Clone Wars and Rebels and the video games and stuff, every time they introduce new characters who are Jedi, who are hanging around after Order 66, it makes that statement make less sense.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
To me, that's a continuity break. If they had shown something happen with Kanan/Caleb where, like, we know about his character that he doesn't trust clones and that he has this incredible sense of guilt and of loss because of how his master died protecting him. Mm. If that had changed in some way, to me, that's a continuity break. And I'm saying this very carefully because for me, I've gone on record that aesthetics don't matter very much. And it's entirely possible, I think, that some people get a level of meaning out of the campfire scene versus this scene that I don't. So this is just me. For me, whether or not that scene happens around a campfire or the way that it does here, and whether or not the Bad Batch are there or it's a different bunch of clones, none of that changes the fundamental truths about Caleb's character that this scene teaches us. And So for me, that's why I'm kind of like, this doesn't feel like a continuity break or a canon break, because it's about a detail that is aesthetically interesting, but I don't think is relevant in any way for the character.
Yeah, I think that is super valid and a very insightful take. And I know we're going long here, but I would compare it to other comic book properties when you have an opportunity to allow the character to be portrayed by a different race, or in some cases a different gender, and it doesn't do anything to inherently change the character. Go for it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a different point, but that's one I definitely I definitely see the connection there. I think I do very much agree with that.
Yeah, I would just say I feel like that's very explicitly and literally a continuity break, but with but I will say that the difference between the idea of canon that we've talked about before, right? That what you think of as canon, I very much respect that this fits that, right? That it's like those two stories are similar enough. They carry the same weight for the character, that even if the continuity is literally different, like canonically, it's like, no, the story of Caleb is how, what happened when when Order 66 happened, and how that informed who Kanan Jarrus was.
Right. And again, and let me just say also, I think, like, when you talk about like gender or race flipping a character, I do think that's a change, because part of it's the idea of saying, what if you take those same experiences but put it through a different context? But that's not necessarily a bad thing.
No, that's totally valid. I guess I was more speaking to the fact that you were talking about, aesthetics not being necessarily, critical. But
right. Yeah, I mean, to me, I think maybe a better example is making the Tony Stark story about Afghanistan instead of Vietnam, Like,
okay. That's totally valid. Yeah.
But I think, yeah, and again, here, I don't know the comics that well. And so if part of the point is that, Caleb is so scared because it's at night and because, like, he can't see what's happening, and that's influence, then yeah, I would say then maybe that's a key part of the story that we're missing. But that's the only, but I think if it is just a question of like how it looks and the aesthetic of it, then I think that it's less significant. But I think that's not to invalidate at all what Aaron or anyone else thinks about it. So
yeah, I think I'd be annoyed if I read that comic and then saw this. I'd be like, but that's not what happened.
Yeah, that's fair. That's definitely.
But for me here, I'm like, I don't care what happened in the comic.
For what it's worth, Aaron reads a lot of comics. He's given us some feedback on Invincible that we just got finished covering on Animation Deliberation, and it's been really interesting to get his insights as a fan of the series first and foremost, and then the adaptation. So
yeah. Well, Aaron, thank you very much then for that, and please, you and anyone else, if there's stuff from the video games or comics that we haven't seen, like even I'm saying, like, to me that doesn't matter as much. That one detail, please keep sending us the stuff, because I think it's fascinating and such an interesting perspective.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
I'll also say, just to give a little more like perspective on this kind of stuff, I recently was able to track down a poster that I had when I was a child hanging over my my bed, my early room. I think, Paul, even before I knew you, this is when I was like 10, 12. And it's an early publicity poster for Star Wars. And it shows Luke Skywalker with an incredibly like Chris Hemsworth Thor, level of chest muscles, holding up a lightsaber while Princess Leia clings to his leg in a very kind of like submissive but powerful way, holding a blaster, wearing this like flimsy white thing that her like leg all the way up to the thigh is like sticking out of and like showing off her leg. And it's like, this is like 70s pulp sci-fi. This has nothing to do with the movie.
Right.
They used the same artwork when they did the 2005 DVD re-releases.
Yeah. And so I do wonder who's the guy who like saw that poster in 78 and then was like, wait, where's Leia's outfit? I don't get it.
They just had to wait a few years till Return of the Jedi came out, and they're like, oh, okay, gold bikini, cool.
There you go. That'll do it for us.
Nice.
Anyway, so Aaron, thanks so much for writing in. Other people, please write in. Let us know what you think. I'll give that information in a second, but just know that kind of feedback is what makes this show so great, and would love to hear more of it. As I said, though, all of us are doing other projects as well. A big thing we're doing this season is collaborating with the folks from Animation Deliberation, who, J Scotty, you are now on my list with Paul of people who have annoyed me by making me watch interesting television. Him and Zuhair on the Animation Deliberation are covering a show called Invincible,
Correct.
Which is both... Anyone who listens to me watch The Boys knows that I don't really deal well with blood and gore, and it has a lot of that, but it's also incredibly good, and I would not have gotten into it if it weren't for you and Zuhair talking about it so much. So
Cool.
Talk to us about what you guys are doing on Animation Deliberation, both with that show and with other stuff coming up.
Yes, indeed. So, as I mentioned, we just got finished with our coverage of the first season. It was 8 episodes that premiered on Amazon Prime there. We had an absolute blast covering that, as well as we've also been doing Young Justice. That's taken a little bit of a backseat as we've started to get more and more series coming out here. Obviously, we're really excited to have the opportunity to do this collaboration with you for Bad Batch, but right after that, towards the end of May, we'll roll right into MODOK. And
Nice.
yeah, that'll be an absolute blast to cover as well. So as far as Animation Deliberation goes, we should be on all the various podcasting platforms there in terms of how you get your podcasts. We are still a new show, so if you have the time and like what we're doing here, please leave us a review. Apple Podcast is kind of the one that takes precedent. Of course, we'll take reviews on whatever platform you prefer, but if you do leave the review on the Apple Podcast, we are still doing our t-shirt giveaway, which is one of the benefits of being part of the Stranded Panda Network. So please check us out, Animation Deliberation Podcast, and if you have feedback, animationdeliberation.podcast@gmail.com is the place to send that, or you can tag myself or Zuhair in the Stranded Panda chat, and if you're not a part of that, I can't encourage you enough to check out all the wonderful things that go on there.
Awesome. Yeah. I've listened to your episodes about Young Justice, and I'm really looking forward to listening to what you guys have to say about Incredible. I don't know why I keep calling it that. Invincible.
We will cover the Incredibles at some point down the road.
Yeah. There you go. Sure. Paul, what about you? If people want to hear more what you're doing.
Just add Zen Madman at the places. Yeah, that's all.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, Paul has also been off and on at various points in time on this podcast, as well as Superhero Ethics. He and I, as well as a new podcaster we've been working with named Will Freeland, new to us. He's been doing some great podcasts on comic stuff, on Hype is My Superpower podcast. But the three of us did a whole series on the ethics of Falcon the Winter Soldier. Definitely worth checking out and hearing Paul on that. And I'd say there's also so many other great podcasts on the Stranded Panda Network. There you'll find podcasts about Star Trek, obviously Star Wars, the MCU, so many great things. Check out all that stuff. And before I do my contact information, I just want to give one last quick plug for myself. In my other life, I work as a nonprofit executive. I work for an organization called Code Savvy. It's a group I really believe in. It starts with the idea that for a lot of people, especially girls or kids of color or kids who don't have many economic resources, the doors to learning about computer science and technology and things like that are often closed, either because they don't have access or because they only ever see white boys and white males doing that kind of work and they don't think that they're welcome in it. My organization is dedicated to really fixing that. We do that through everything from Spanish language coding clubs at schools to teaching teachers how to bring coding into those environments, to holding girls-only coding opportunities and entrepreneurship opportunities, to hands-on mentorship-led activities for all kids that are targeted at schools that need it most. All kind of great activities like that. We're in the middle of our spring fundraiser. We're trying to raise money for a number of things, including to expand our staff and to expand our resources and our ability to really reach the kids who need it most. If you're interested in this, if you go to giveMN.org and search for Code Savvy, CODESAVVY, you'll find our fundraiser. You can give, 5, 10. I mean, more is great, but even just like $5, $10, getting more people donating, more people aware of it is such a great thing. I'll also put a link to the fundraiser in the show notes for this. You can check that out there. So if not, no worries at all. There's so many other good causes right now that people can give to, but if you got a few bucks, if you think helping more kids learn about computer science and helping more kids learn they can be creators, not just users of technology, please give that a thought. That said, if you want to contact us, all the podcasting that I do goes under the name The Ethical Panda. You can search for The Ethical Panda on Facebook or Twitter. You can email us at theethicalpanda@gmail.com. Or you can find all that by just going to theethicalpanda.com. So on behalf of myself, Scotty, Paul, Zuhair, and Brian, who are going to be here for other episodes, thank you all so much. Have a great day.
May the force be with you.
And also with you. Because I'll never outgrow my Episcopalian childhood.